The sun was shining brightly over the city park, casting golden rays through the trees and filling the air with warmth. It was one of those perfect afternoons where families gathered for picnics, children laughed as they chased each other around, and joggers weaved their way along the winding paths. Among them was Marcus Thompson, a man whose presence commanded respect even in silence. Sitting tall in his wheelchair, he navigated the uneven pavement with practiced ease, his smile warm and inviting. Despite the challenges life had thrown at him, a spinal cord injury that left him unable to walk, Marcus carried himself with an unshakable spirit. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. Marcus loved coming to this park. It was a place where he could escape the noise of the world, if only for a little while. Today, however, peace seemed elusive. As he rounded a corner near the central fountain, his wheels hit a crack in the pavement. The jolt caused him to lose control momentarily, and before he could steady himself, his wheelchair bumped into someone standing nearby. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Marcus said immediately, his voice calm but apologetic. He looked up to see who he'd accidentally collided with. Standing there was Sarah Collins, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, her designer sunglasses perched atop her head. She was flanked by a group of colleagues, all of whom were chatting animatedly until the moment of impact. For a split second, there was silence. Then Sarah's expression shifted, from surprise to irritation, then something darker. "What is wrong with you?" she snapped, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. Her eyes scanned him from head to toe, lingering on his wheelchair. "Can't you watch where you're going? Or are you too lazy to even try?" Marcus blinked, taken aback by the venom in her words. Before he could respond, she continued, her voice rising loud enough for passersby to hear. "You people always find a way to make everything about yourselves, don't you? Taking up space, expecting everyone else to accommodate you." Her gaze flicked dismissively toward his wheelchair again, and her lips curled into a sneer. "Maybe if you weren't so reliant on handouts, you'd actually be useful." Her words hung heavy in the air, dripping with disdain. A few people nearby stopped what they were doing, turning to watch the scene unfold. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure whether to intervene. Others whispered among themselves, shaking their heads at the audacity of Sarah's remarks. But Marcus didn't shrink under her glare. Instead, he took a deep breath, steadying himself both physically and emotionally. "I didn't mean to bump into you," he said firmly, meeting her gaze without flinching. "And I apologize for that. But nothing gives you the right to speak to anyone like this. Your attitude says more about you than it does about me." For a moment, Sarah seemed caught off guard by his composure. But instead of backing down, she let out a derisive laugh, rolling her eyes, as though his response was beneath her. "Whatever," she muttered, waving him off like an inconvenience. With that, she turned back to her colleagues, pretending the incident never happened. But it wasn't over, not by a long shot. Unbeknownst to Sarah, a young woman sitting on a nearby bench had recorded the entire exchange on her phone. And as the video began circulating online, the ripple effects of Sarah's actions would soon spiral far beyond anything she could have imagined. The young woman who had recorded the incident, a college student named Emily, hadn't planned to capture anything extraordinary that day. She was simply enjoying the park, scrolling through her phone while keeping an ear out for the sound of birds chirping and children laughing. But when she heard Sarah's sharp, cutting words directed at Marcus, something inside her stirred. Without hesitation, she lifted her phone and began recording. At first, Emily wasn't sure what she would do with the video. She just knew it felt important to document what was happening. As she watched Marcus handle the situation with quiet dignity, her respect for him grew. When Sarah dismissed him with a wave of her hand and turned away as though nothing had happened, Emily's blood boiled. This wasn't just rude behavior, it was cruel, calculated, and laced with prejudice. Later that evening, still unsettled by what she'd witnessed, Emily decided to post the clip on social media. She added a short caption, "This happened today in the park," Racism and ableism are real, and we need to call them out when we see them. She tagged a few local community groups and hit upload, not expecting much. After all, how often does one viral post actually make a difference? But within minutes, notifications began flooding in. Likes, shares, and comments poured onto her screen like a tidal wave. People were outraged, not just by Sarah's blatant disrespect, but also by the casual entitlement she displayed. The video spread like wildfire, hopping from platform to platform. By morning, it had millions of views, sparking heated discussions across Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and beyond. Hashtags started trending almost immediately. #JusticeForMarcus became a rallying cry, with users sharing stories of their own experiences facing discrimination. Others pointed out the intersectionality of Marcus's identity as both Black and disabled, highlighting how society often marginalizes individuals who belong to multiple oppressed groups. Activists chimed in, using the moment to educate viewers about systemic racism and ableism. Even celebrities joined the conversation, amplifying Marcus's story and calling for accountability. Meanwhile, Sarah remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing online. That night, she attended a networking event, mingling effortlessly with colleagues and industry leaders. She laughed, sipped wine, and discussed upcoming projects, completely oblivious to the fact that her life was about to change forever. Her arrogance seemed impenetrable, her confidence unshaken. To anyone watching, she appeared untouchable, a powerful figure whose words carried weight in boardrooms and beyond. By the next morning, however, reality came crashing down. News outlets picked up the story, running headlines like "Corporate Executive Caught Mocking Disabled Man in Viral Video," and "Public Outcry Erupts Over Racist Remarks in City Park." Reporters dug into Sarah's background, uncovering details about her career trajectory and public persona. What they found painted a picture of someone who thrived on control and dominance, often stepping on others to climb the ladder of success. As the day wore on, the backlash intensified. Viewers dissected every second of the video, analyzing Sarah's tone, body language, and choice of words. Some criticized her lack of empathy, while others focused on the broader societal issues her actions represented. Calls for consequences echoed loudly, with many demanding that her employer take immediate action. For Marcus, the attention was overwhelming but validating. Strangers reached out to thank him for his grace under pressure, crediting him with shining a light on injustices that too often go unnoticed. And yet, amidst the chaos, one thing was clear. Sarah's world was about to be turned upside down. And there was no going back. By the time Sarah woke up the next morning, her name was everywhere. The video had exploded online, and screenshots of her face, twisted in disdain as she mocked Marcus, were plastered across social media platforms. News anchors talked about her on morning shows, activists dissected her behavior in fiery threads, and memes mocking her entitled attitude began circulating at lightning speed. For someone who prided herself on being polished and untouchable, this sudden wave of public scrutiny felt like a nightmare. At first, Sarah tried to brush it off. She scrolled through her phone, reading some of the comments with growing irritation. People are overreacting, she muttered to herself, sipping her coffee. It's just one little incident. Why is everyone making such a big deal out of it? But the more she read, the harder it became to ignore the sheer volume of anger directed at her. Thousands of people were calling her out, not just for what she said to Marcus, but for the deeper issues her words represented. Racism, ableism, privilege, entitlement. Each accusation stung a little more than the last. Meanwhile, employees from her company started coming forward anonymously, sharing stories that painted an even uglier picture of Sarah's behavior. One former colleague described how she once berated a junior staff member for taking medical leave, accusing them of being lazy and milking the system. Another recounted how she made racially insensitive jokes during meetings, laughing them off when challenged. These accounts spread quickly, fueling the firestorm against her. What had started as outrage over a single incident in the park now seemed like evidence of a pattern, a toxic personality shielded by power and privilege. Public pressure mounted, and soon, major news outlets reached out to Sarah's employer for comment. At first, the company issued a vague statement saying they were looking into the matter. But the response only angered people further. Protesters gathered outside their headquarters, holding signs that read "No room for racism" and "Accountability starts here." Customers threatened to boycott their products, while sponsors began pulling partnerships left and right. It became clear that silence wasn't an option anymore. Inside the company, tensions ran high. Executives held emergency meetings behind closed doors, debating how to handle the situation. Some argued that firing Sarah would set a dangerous precedent, while others insisted it was the only way to save the brand's reputation. In the end, they decided to release a stronger public statement, condemning her actions and promising a full investigation. "We do not tolerate discrimination or hate speech in any form," the statement read. "This behavior does not reflect our values as a company." But the damage was already done. Sarah's carefully curated image, the one she'd spent years building, was crumbling before her eyes. Friends stopped returning her calls, fearing guilt by association. Industry contacts distanced themselves, unwilling to risk being linked to her scandal. Even her family struggled to defend her, torn between loyalty and disbelief. For Marcus, the backlash against Sarah was bittersweet. On one hand, he was grateful that so many people stood up for him and recognized the injustice of what happened. On the other hand, he couldn't help but feel frustrated that it took something so extreme to spark meaningful conversation. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was about all the others who faced similar treatment, but never had a moment like this to shine a light on it. As the days passed, Sarah found herself increasingly isolated. Her attempts to downplay the situation fell flat, and her usual charm failed to win anyone back. The woman who once commanded respect in boardrooms now faced scorn wherever she went. And though she still clung to denial, deep down, she knew her life and career would never be the same again. The fallout from the viral video hit Sarah's company like a wrecking ball. Once a respected name in the industry, the organization now found itself at the center of a public relations disaster. Employees whispered nervously in hallways, wondering how far-reaching the consequences would be. Clients called demanding explanations, and partners began reviewing their contracts, looking for exit clauses. The pressure was relentless, and everyone knew that Sarah's actions had put the entire company's reputation on the line. At first, executives tried to distance themselves from her. They released another statement, this time stronger and more direct. "We condemn racism and discrimination in all forms. The behavior displayed in the video is unacceptable and does not align with our core values." But words weren't enough. Protesters continued to gather outside their offices, chanting slogans and holding signs that read, "Fire her now." Social media campaigns urged customers to boycott the company until they took concrete action. Every day brought fresh headlines, each one more damaging than the last. Behind closed doors, tensions within the company reached a breaking point. Some argued that firing Sarah would send a clear message that such behavior wouldn't be tolerated. Others worried about setting a precedent or opening the door to lawsuits. But as the negative publicity mounted, it became impossible to ignore the financial toll. Major sponsors pulled out, citing ethical concerns. Retailers stopped stocking their products. Stock prices plummeted, wiping millions off the company's value. It was clear that keeping Sarah on board wasn't just morally questionable, it was bad for business. Finally, after days of deliberation, the board made its decision. Sarah was summoned to an emergency meeting, where she sat stiffly in a leather chair, flanked by lawyers. Her usual confidence seemed to waver as executives explained that her position was no longer tenable. "This isn't personal," one of them said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But we have a responsibility to protect the company and its employees." Sarah tried to argue, insisting that she'd been misunderstood and that the backlash was unfair. It was one mistake, she protested, her voice rising. People make mistakes every day. Why should mine cost me everything? But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The room remained silent, save for the sound of papers shuffling as her termination letter was slid across the table. For the first time in years, Sarah felt powerless. News of her firing spread instantly, sparking another wave of reactions online. Some celebrated the decision, calling it a victory for accountability. Others pointed out that losing a job wasn't nearly enough punishment for someone whose words had caused so much harm. Meanwhile, Sarah retreated from public view, canceling appearances and deleting her social media accounts. Rumors swirled about her mental state, with some claiming she was devastated while others speculated she was plotting a comeback. For Marcus, the news brought mixed emotions. On one hand, he felt a sense of vindication, proof that standing up for himself had made a difference. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah's downfall was only a small step toward addressing the larger issues at play. Racism and ableism didn't start with her, and they certainly wouldn't end with her firing. Still, he hoped her story would serve as a wake-up call, a reminder that words have consequences and that privilege comes with responsibility. As Sarah packed up her office, boxing up awards and framed photos, she couldn't help but reflect on how quickly everything had unraveled. Just weeks ago, she'd been untouchable, admired for her ambition and success. Now she was a pariah, her name synonymous with prejudice and arrogance. As she walked out of the building for the last time, cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions, she realized something painful. The world she thought she ruled had moved on without her, and there was no going back. In the days following Sarah's firing, Marcus found himself at the center of a whirlwind he hadn't anticipated. Strangers reached out to him daily, some offering support, others sharing their own stories of discrimination and hardship. Messages poured in from people who saw themselves in his struggle, thanking him for standing tall when faced with cruelty. At first, Marcus felt overwhelmed by the attention. He wasn't seeking fame or recognition. He simply wanted respect and fairness. But as the messages kept coming, he began to realize that his experience had struck a chord far deeper than he'd imagined. One morning, while sipping coffee on his porch, Marcus received an email from a prominent news outlet asking for an interview. The subject line read, "Can we talk about what happened?" For a moment, he hesitated. Reliving that day in the park wasn't something he particularly wanted to do. But then he thought about all the people who had shared their stories with him. The single mother raising a disabled child, the young black man passed over for promotions because of his race, the elderly woman who used a walker and faced ridicule in public spaces. Their voices echoed in his mind, urging him not to stay silent. The interview took place in his living room, where cameras captured every detail of his calm demeanor and thoughtful responses. When asked how he managed to remain composed during such a charged encounter, Marcus smiled softly. "It's not easy," he admitted, "but I've learned that anger only fuels more anger. My goal is always to rise above it, to show people that dignity and grace are powerful tools." He went on to share pieces of his journey, speaking candidly about the challenges he faced after his injury. Losing the ability to walk had been devastating, but what hurt even more was the way society treated him afterward. "People look at you differently when you're in a wheelchair," he explained. "They assume you're weak or helpless, and if you're also black, those assumptions double. It's like fighting two battles at once." His words resonated deeply, especially when he described moments of triumph, like graduating top of his class, despite physical limitations, or advocating for accessibility reforms in his community. As the interview aired, viewers were captivated by Marcus's authenticity. Unlike Sarah, whose arrogance alienated so many, Marcus radiated humility and strength. People saw him not just as a victim of injustice, but as a beacon of hope, a reminder that resilience can inspire change. Social media lit up again, this time with hashtags like #ListenToMarcus and #BethaChange. Schools invited him to speak to students, nonprofits sought his guidance, and activists rallied around his message of unity and progress. But Marcus didn't stop there. Recognizing the platform he now had, he partnered with organizations dedicated to fighting racism and ableism. Together, they launched campaigns to educate businesses on inclusivity, pushed for policy changes to improve accessibility in public spaces, and created mentorship programs for marginalized youth. Marcus became a symbol of perseverance, proving that one person's courage could spark a movement. Meanwhile, Sarah watched from afar, her name still synonymous with controversy. She scrolled through articles and videos featuring Marcus, feeling a mix of envy and shame. How had he turned such a painful moment into something positive? Why couldn't she shake off the weight of her own actions? These questions haunted her, gnawing at the edges of her pride. Though she tried to convince herself that the world was unfair, deep down, she knew the truth. Marcus's grace made her behavior look even uglier. For Marcus, however, this chapter wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about using his voice to uplift others and create a better future. As he told reporters during one of his appearances, "This isn't just my story, it's everyone's story. We all deserve to live in a world where kindness outweighs cruelty, where empathy trumps ignorance. That's the kind of legacy I want to leave behind." And with each word, he moved closer to making that vision a reality. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah's life spiraled further into obscurity. Once a high-powered executive with a corner office and an overflowing calendar, she now spent her days in solitude, avoiding public spaces for fear of being recognized. The few friends she had left stopped inviting her to gatherings, and even her family grew distant, unsure how to reconcile the person they knew with the woman vilified in headlines. Her name became synonymous with prejudice, and every attempt she made to rebuild her reputation ended in failure. But the unraveling didn't stop there. As investigations into her past behavior deepened, more allegations surfaced, this time from within her own company. Former employees came forward with stories of harassment, describing how Sarah had belittled them for their race, gender, or disabilities. One recounted how she mocked his accent during a team meeting, reducing him to tears. Another shared how she dismissed her request for ergonomic accommodations, calling it a waste of resources. Each new accusation added fuel to the fire, cementing Sarah's image as someone who abused her power without remorse. The media frenzy reached its peak when a major news outlet published an exposé titled "The Untold Story of Sarah Collins, A Culture of Discrimination." The article included interviews with former colleagues, excerpts from internal emails, and damning testimonials that painted a damning portrait of her leadership style. It revealed how she often sidelined talented employees of color, favoring less qualified candidates who fit her narrow definition of professionalism. Readers were appalled, and calls for accountability intensified. With no job prospects on the horizon and her savings dwindling, Sarah was forced to sell her luxury apartment and move to a modest rental in a quieter part of town. Gone were the designer suits and expensive dinners. Instead, she wore simple clothes and shopped at discount stores. For someone who once thrived on status and control, this loss of privilege was devastating. She tried reaching out to old contacts, hoping to salvage some semblance of her career, but most ignored her messages altogether. In a desperate bid to reclaim her narrative, Sarah agreed to an exclusive interview with a lesser-known podcast host. Sitting across from the host in a dimly lit studio, she attempted to explain herself. "I admit I said things I shouldn't have," she began, her voice trembling. "But I'm not a bad person. I made a mistake, a big one, and I'm sorry for that." However, her apology fell flat. Instead of expressing genuine remorse, she shifted blame onto societal pressures and claimed she'd been set up by opportunistic bystanders. Listeners weren't convinced, and the backlash only grew louder. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to rise as a symbol of resilience and change. His advocacy work gained momentum, earning him invitations to speak at conferences, universities, and community events. He used these platforms to highlight systemic issues, urging audiences to confront their biases and take action. Change doesn't happen overnight, he often said. But if we commit to learning and growing, we can create a world where everyone feels valued. Sarah watched these developments from afar, her bitterness giving way to reflection. Late at night, alone in her small apartment, she found herself replaying Marcus's words in her mind. What would it feel like to inspire others instead of tearing them down? Could she ever earn redemption, or was she destined to carry the weight of her mistakes forever? These questions lingered unanswered, but for the first time, Sarah allowed herself to consider the possibility of change, even if it meant starting over from scratch. The ripple effects of Marcus's courage began to reshape communities in ways no one could have predicted. Inspired by his story, people from all walks of life came together to push for meaningful change. Local governments took notice, drafting resolutions aimed at combating racism and improving accessibility in public spaces. Parks, libraries, and community centers started hosting workshops on inclusivity, inviting activists like Marcus to lead discussions about privilege, bias, and allyship. It wasn't just lip service. Real action was being taken. One city council member proposed a landmark initiative called Access for All, which allocated funds to make sidewalks, buildings, and transportation systems more accessible for people with disabilities. The program also included training sessions for businesses on how to create inclusive environments for employees and customers alike. When the resolution passed unanimously, Marcus stood beside officials at the signing ceremony, his presence a testament to the power of grassroots advocacy. "This is what happens when we listen to each other," he said during his brief speech. "Progress isn't perfect, but it's possible when we work together." Corporations scrambled to align themselves with the growing movement, launching diversity training programs and pledging millions toward social justice initiatives. While some critics dismissed these efforts as performative, others saw them as a starting point, a chance to hold organizations accountable for long-term change. Activists worked tirelessly to ensure that companies didn't just talk the talk but walk the walk, pushing for measurable goals and transparency. For Marcus, this newfound influence came with challenges. He received countless requests to speak at events, collaborate on projects, and consult with organizations. At times, the sheer volume of demands felt overwhelming. But he reminded himself why he was doing this, not for recognition, but to amplify voices that had been silenced for too long. To stay grounded, he leaned on his support system, friends, family, and fellow advocates who shared his vision of a better world. Meanwhile, Sarah's name faded from the headlines, replaced by stories of hope and progress. Yet her downfall remained a cautionary tale, often cited in conversations about accountability and privilege. Schools began using her story as a case study in ethics classes, asking students to analyze the consequences of unchecked bias. Even late-night comedians joked about her fall from grace, turning her into a punchline. For many, she became a symbol of what happens when power goes unchecked and empathy is absent. But something unexpected happened along the way. As Sarah retreated further from public life, she stumbled upon a small community center in her neighborhood. Desperate for distraction, she signed up to volunteer, thinking it might help fill the void left by her shattered career. At first, she kept to herself, sorting donations and organizing supplies without engaging much with others. Over time, though, she began interacting with the people who frequented the center. Families struggling to make ends meet, seniors looking for companionship, and young adults navigating life with disabilities. Through these interactions, Sarah started seeing the world differently. She met a teenager named Jamal, who used a wheelchair similar to Marcus's, and found herself drawn to his optimism despite the challenges he faced. Another regular visitor, an elderly woman named Rosa, shared stories of immigrating to the country and facing discrimination because of her accent. Slowly, Sarah began confronting her own biases, realizing how deeply ingrained they were. It wasn't easy. Guilt and shame still lingered, but she made a conscious effort to listen and learn. Back in the spotlight, Marcus continued thriving, proving that compassion and perseverance could spark transformative change. His journey inspired countless individuals to stand up against injustice, while Sarah's slow path toward redemption served as a reminder that growth, though difficult, was always possible. Together, their stories underscored a powerful truth. Even in the face of hatred, humanity has the capacity to heal and to build bridges where walls once stood. Months turned into a year, and the world moved on from the viral incident that had once dominated headlines. Marcus continued to thrive, using his platform not just to advocate for change, but to inspire others to take action in their own lives. He became a mentor to young activists, teaching them how to navigate challenges while staying true to their values. His work extended beyond speeches and campaigns. He rolled up his sleeves and got involved in local projects, helping build ramps for schools, organizing food drives for underserved communities, and even spearheading a scholarship fund for students with disabilities. Though he was celebrated as a hero by many, Marcus never let fame go to his head. He remained humble, always reminding people that real progress came from collective effort, not individual glory. "I'm just one piece of the puzzle," he often said during interviews. "The real heroes are the ones who show up every day, doing the hard work without expecting recognition." His words resonated deeply, encouraging ordinary people to believe they too could make a difference. For Sarah, life had transformed in ways she never imagined. Volunteering at the community center became her lifeline, a way to rebuild herself after losing everything. At first, it was awkward. People recognized her name, and some were hesitant to trust her intentions. But over time, her consistent presence and small acts of kindness began to soften their skepticism. She started tutoring children in reading, assisting seniors with grocery shopping, and even organizing events to raise awareness about accessibility issues. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. One day, while setting up chairs for a community meeting, Sarah found herself sitting next to Jamal, the teenager in the wheelchair who reminded her so much of Marcus. They struck up a conversation, and she cautiously asked him what he thought about her past behavior. To her surprise, Jamal didn't lash out or judge her harshly. Instead, he said, "Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is whether you learn from them and try to do better." Those simple words hit Sarah like a thunderclap. For the first time, she realized that redemption wasn't about erasing her past. It was about proving through her actions that she was capable of growth. As months passed, Sarah's efforts began to earn quiet respect within the community. While she would never fully escape the shadow of her past, she no longer ran from it either. She embraced it as a reminder of how far she'd come and how much farther she still needed to go. Her journey wasn't easy, and there were days when guilt threatened to overwhelm her. But each act of service brought her closer to peace, helping her redefine who she was and what she stood for. Meanwhile, Marcus achieved another milestone, the publication of his memoir, titled Rising Above. The book chronicled his life before and after the park incident, offering readers an intimate look at his struggles and triumphs. It quickly became a bestseller, praised for its honesty and wisdom. In the final chapter, Marcus reflected on the impact of that fateful day. "That moment in the park wasn't just about me or Sarah," he wrote. "It was a mirror held up to society, showing us both our flaws and our potential. We can choose to ignore it, or we can use it as fuel to create something better." Years later, when people looked back on this chapter of history, they saw two very different paths, one of resilience and advocacy, the other of accountability and redemption. Marcus's story inspired countless individuals to stand against injustice, while Sarah's taught them that even those who fall the hardest can rise again, if they're willing to change. Together, their journey served as a powerful reminder that humanity is messy, imperfect, and full of second chances. And sometimes, amidst the chaos, we find opportunities to heal, not just ourselves, but the world around us.